Hi, everybody. Welcome to our January webinar at Ramapo College of New Jersey Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to introduce our topic and our speakers. If you don't know me already, my name is Karen Binder. I'm the Assistant Director of the Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center, and I'm also the Director of the Investigative Genetic Genealogy Certificate Program at Ramapo College of New Jersey. I have been trying to increase our online presence and our alumni engagement by holding webinars. So in December, we had an alumni exclusive webinar that was only for people that have taken the IGG certificate program or the IGG boot camp. And now today's webinar is open to the public. So we wanted to get the word out about this awesome talk that was originally given at RIG, our conference in 2024. And this talk, which is going to be presented today by Traci Onders and Alan Grasser, is called Finding Norm, the 43-year journey to identify Rhinelander John Doe. So this presentation was originally given at RIG 2024 in person by Alan and Traci for the first time. If you missed that presentation, you're lucky enough that you get to catch it here. Although today's version will be slightly modified to be more friendly to the public and people that are unfamiliar with investigative genetic genealogy. It is a version of the same talk that was given at RIG 2024. If you're interested in coming to RIG in 2025, registration is currently open. The event is going to be June 27th to 29th, and you can find that information on our website, which I'll show you towards the end of this presentation. And now I will introduce our wonderful speakers. Thank you both for coming. Oh, you know what? Sorry. First, I have housekeeping. I want everybody, if you have not used WebEx before, please get familiar with the chat and with the Q&A. Keep in mind that I cannot unmute anybody except for panelists. So if you have a question, you have to type it into the Q&A or the chat. If you have a question that you want us to answer, I'd really prefer if you put it in the Q&A, because the chat, much to its name, it gets real chatty in there and it can be hard to fish out the questions. So towards the end of this presentation, I'm going to pull the questions from the Q&A and have and read them for Traci and Alan to answer. Again, only panelists can unmute, so I can't unmute anybody else to talk in this webinar. Traci Onders is one of our two speakers here. Traci is a skilled IgG practitioner and a member of the advanced DNA team, contributing research on both unidentified human remains and criminal cases, and is a team leader at the DNA Doe project. She also is a program support assistant at the IgG Center and enjoys sharing her passion for investigative genetic genealogy and resolving unsolved cases while helping students learn IgG methods, techniques, and skills. With more than 9 years of experience applying genetic genealogy methods, Traci has resolved more than 300 cases of unknown parentage and provided support services to hundreds more while serving as program manager for an adoption support nonprofit. Additionally, she brings extensive experience and training in mediation, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion, and many years of leadership in a wide array of community volunteer organizations. As a confident presenter and educator, she enjoys sharing her experience and investing in the development of others. Same as she's doing today. Thank you so much, Traci, for coming. Alan Grasser, our guest of honor, as Traci said earlier, is also here to present. And the day after Memorial Day, May 30th, 2023, Alan Grasser received a phone call that would profoundly change his life. His brother, Norman Grasser, had finally been identified after being missing for 43 years. Alan, a lifelong native of the Chicago area and retired professional at the Chicago Transit Authority for 35 years, finally had some answers that he and his family had been searching for over 4 decades. Alan, an avid genealogist, continues to uphold his brother's legacy by preserving and expanding the genealogical work that Norm actually had began, by formulating the foundation of the Grasser family history before his disappearance in 1980. Alan currently operates and maintains the 123-year-old Century Grasser Family Farm in Porterfield, Wisconsin. Thank you so much, Alan, for coming. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Traci and Alan for the presentation, and then we'll come to the questions at the end.
Thank you, Karen. Let me pull up. All righty. Okay, so for today's presentation, we are going to start with a brief overview of investigative genetic genealogy. And then we're going to talk about how we applied those techniques and principles to determining the identity of Rhinelander John Doe. After that, I'm going to turn it over to Alan, who will discuss his journey as the brother of a missing loved one and what it was like to finally have an answer. Then hopefully we will have time for questions. Jumping right in, IgG is based on genetic genealogy, which is the use of DNA testing in combination with traditional genealogical research. And for that, we use historical documentary evidence and public records that infer relationships between individuals. The first DNA tests that were available to the public were mitochondrial DNA and Y-DNA tests, and these were sold first in the year 2000. However, genetic genealogy really gained popularity when autosomal DNA tests became available in 2013. Autosomal DNA testing was a game changer because it provides information on all ancestral lines by giving information on the people that share DNA among the 22 chromosomes and the X. The results of autosomal DNA testing provide biogeographical ancestral information, so those ethnicity estimates that everybody really loves to hear about, and also represent relatives in a much more recent time span than the other DNA tests. So they can reliably predict relationships within 5 to 6 generations. You might be familiar with some of the most popular DNA tests on the market, the autosomal kits, Ancestry, with over 25 million DNA results in its database, and 23andMe, with over 14 million DNA results in its database. Now, investigative genetic genealogy is not able to use those DNA databases. We can use the databases of GEDmatch, which has about 1.6 million, and FTDNA, which has about 1.7 million tests in its database. Now, these smaller databases, what that generally means is that we're dealing with fewer and much more distant relative matches, and you will see that as we look at the case example. And that makes it much more difficult to find the connections we need. Now, investigative genetic genealogy means we're taking that genetic genealogy, but now we're comparing the DNA from crime scenes or unidentified remains with the genetic profiles in those public databases that we talked about. Again, we're following this up with traditional genealogical research, building family trees from public records, and our goal with IgG is to identify leads for law enforcement agencies to investigate. You might also see IgG referred to as forensic genetic genealogy or FGG or FIG or some variations. They all mean the same things. The first publicly announced cases of investigative genetic genealogy were both announced in April of 2018. In one of the cases, the DNA Doe Project performed the investigative genetic genealogy on the remains of Buckskin Girl, and it was publicly announced that she was identified as Marcia L. King, and she had been found in Troy, Ohio. The other case that was announced at the same time was the Golden State Killer was identified by the investigative genetic genealogy work of Barbara Ray Venter and her team, Joseph James D'Angelo. He was identified, arrested, and convicted for crimes occurring from 1974 until 1986. And that included 12 murders, over 50 rapes, and over 100 burglaries. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, law enforcement already uses DNA for identification purposes. And that's true. They've been doing that for decades, but it's a different type of testing. And this slide will help visualize those differences. Law enforcement uses STR testing. That stands for short tandem repeat, and it uses tens or dozens of markers. This is useful for comparison of crime scene DNA with that of a suspect or possibly a first-degree relative. That means a parent or child or sometimes a full sibling. STR testing is accepted in court as evidence, and it is what is used in the CODIST, which is the Combined DNA Index System, a national database of DNA profiles that law enforcement uses to link crimes and identify suspects. So as you can see, you can get that one person or very close relatives. Now, SNP testing is what we use in IgG and in those autosomal DNA kits like Ancestry and 23andMe. SNP testing stands for single nucleotide polymorphism, and it utilizes hundreds of thousands or millions of markers. It can reliably pinpoint much more distant relatives, and it is not accepted as evidence in court, though. It's a lead that is confirmed by further investigation and testing. So you can see SNP testing gives you the extended family, the background, the ethnicity, much more than STR testing, but it's different processing and different databases. So what does that process actually look like? The unidentified human remains DNA or crime scene DNA is uploaded into CODIS. If there's a match, the subject's identified and the agency can investigate. If there isn't a match, that's when IgG might be considered if there's enough DNA and it's not too degraded or contaminated. A SNP profile would be developed. IgG is utilized, a lead with the goal of presenting a lead to the agency to investigate and perform confirmatory testing. Now, developing a SNP profile, we might use a sample and the things that we use for samples can include bones or teeth, hair, or a blood card from an autopsy. This is then sent to the lab for extraction, followed by SNP array or whole genome sequencing, and then bioinformatics, which will give us a usable SNP profile for upload into the public databases that we talked about that we use. Those databases, again, are GEDmatch, FTDNA, and now a small nonprofit has also formed to create an option to the rising costs of GEDmatch Pro and FTDNA. Again, we can't utilize Ancestry or 23andMe to do this. Our output from these databases would be an ethnicity breakdown, as well as a DNA relative match list. So this is a list of all the people that share DNA with the subject and how much DNA they share. That relative match list is then sorted into clusters. We're going to focus on the top matches and see who they share DNA with. And we want to form distinct groups of people that share DNA with the subject and with each other. Our goal at this point is to determine how these DNA relative matches are related. So who is their common ancestor? We might use advanced techniques such as chromosome mapping to determine opposite parent sides and triangulated segments. Our next mission is to determine how each cluster of relatives is related. So who is that common ancestor? And to answer that question, we build genealogical profiles for the subject's DNA relative matches using those public records, building family trees, and building back in time. We want to know parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and even farther back than we have on this visual. Once we find a common ancestor, we then will assess, have we built back far enough in time? We might still need to build back further, or we may figure out that, okay, we've built back far enough, we can now start descendancy research. That means now we have our common ancestor, and we want to build down and find all the descendants. Find any additional spouses or unions and all the descendants of those unions. We want every child, grandchild, great-grandchild, and so forth. And as we're doing that, we are looking for where this cluster and another cluster of DNA relative matches meet or have a union with each other. And once we find that union, our subject might be likely to descend from this union couple. We're then going to focus on the descendants of the union couple. Here I have it visualized as parents, but it could be grandparents or great-grandparents, or even back farther. Now we're going to focus on their descendants and determine if any fit the subject's predicted age, gender, etc. If it's an identified human remains case, we're also going to be looking for proof of life for the descendants. And we do all of this with the goal of hopefully being able to provide law enforcement with a candidate or candidates or leads for them to investigate and possibly rule in or out with further testing. That's a quick overview of the process if it's moving along smoothly, which we almost always hit some snags. Some of those complications can include things that we don't really have a lot of time to explain too much in detail, but complications include endogamy, misattributed parentage, so things like adoption or artificial reproduction, a lack of representation in the IgG databases. So Western European ancestry is well represented, but other populations are not adequately represented generally. There might also be a lack of representation due to recent immigration. And if there isn't available documentation, we have a hard time building back those genealogical profiles. So the case that I'm presenting today is Rhinelander John Doe, 1980. And it's a case that I worked at while I was a student here at Ramapo IgG Center in the inaugural cohort of the certificate program. If you're not familiar with that, it's a 15-week remote program with the goal of training students to become proficient and ethical practitioners. And I now have the honor and privilege of being on staff and helping do that. During those 15 weeks, we cover things like case management, communication with agencies and labs, ethics, and we take a deep dive into techniques and methods used to solve IgG cases and culminate with actually working on teams on actually unsolved cases. Each case of unidentified human remains has a unique nickname to humanize the individual until we are able to use their actual identity. For this case, we use the nickname Jerry. This is the team of 10 students, along with our director, Karen Binder, and the IgG Center director, David Gurney, who worked on Rhinelander John Doe. The headline of the local newspaper the day after the remains were discovered indicated hikers find body on trail. This map provides a fuller understanding of the location of the discovery, 4 miles north of Rhinelander in a town called Pine Lake. This is 160 miles from Green Bay, about 250 miles from Milwaukee, and close to 330 miles from Chicago. Over the next 4 decades, attempts to identify the remains were unsuccessful. Almost 40 years later, the case was reinvigorated and a NamUs entry was created in October of 2019. That gave the details on the date the body was found, as well as the location. The exact postmortem interval is not listed. However, it was estimated to be no more than a few months. The remains were thought to be a white male between the ages of 25 to 45. Details of his physical description were also provided. And what you see here is a rendering from a local newspaper in April of 1980. The NamUs posts included photographs of the clothing and accessories that were found with the remains. And there was also a wallet and with money in it on the remains. However, that was not listed in NamUs. Unfortunately, that NamUs post did not yield any useful leads. So in January of 2023, the Oneida County Sheriff's Office and Ramapo IGG Center partnered with the intention of utilizing investigative genetic genealogy to identify Rhinelander John Doe. In February of 2023, a tooth sample was sent to Intermountain Forensics for extraction and whole genome sequencing, followed by bioinformatics, which was provided by Sabre Investigations. Bioinformatics told us that the mitochondrial haplogroup was H5E1A1, and this told us that the matrilineal line was from Europe, basically. And the Y-DNA haplogroup was RZ36. Again, this told us that the patrilineal line was also from Europe. That bioinformatics with the SNP profile we're able now to upload that to GEDmatch, and that was done on May 13th, 2023. And we had our ethnicity estimate or admixture from GEDmatch. This again tells us that our subject is European. And the FTDNA, my origins, came later, but I've included that here as well. This is a recreated DNA match list. I've swapped out the names and there's no identifying information here, but the amounts of shared DNA are the same. So the GEDmatch DNA matches include a top match here in the range of third cousin. Then we had one that was somewhat close to that, and then it drops down pretty quickly from there. And these matches, they could be maybe fourth to eighth cousins. They get pretty distant. The team began building genealogical profiles for the DNA matches. An initial assessment of Rhinelander John Doe's DNA matches indicate he may have recent immigration in his family tree, possibly from Germany or Austria. And there were also some DNA cousins from the Midwest, Wisconsin and Iowa. Our team felt this case would benefit from additional matches on a second database, Family Tree DNA, So we requested that, and the process can take about a week or so. So the team continued to research the matches that we had while we waited. We began to suspect that this top match might be adopted, and were able to confirm this with a 2016 social media post in which she stated she was looking for her birth family. We decided to reach out to her and see if she was willing to assist with our case. And she responded immediately, stating that she would like to help, but she did not know half of her family tree. So working with her, we were able to provide her with the identity of her birth father and develop an accurate family tree for her. Now, this was important for our work because now our top match has an accurate family tree, and this provided us with a direction of focus for our research to identify Rhinelander John Doe. We were energized and excited, and then later that same day, we finally were able to access our FT DNA match list, and that was a game changer. Again, I've changed all the names except for our top match here, Alan, who shares 34% of his DNA with our Rhinelander John Doe. This indicates a very close and unique relationship in genetic genealogy. It's an indication of a full sibling match. So here is what it looked like on family tree DNA. Mr. Alan Paul Grasser. And the team immediately began working to determine how he connected to that adoptee's family tree that we were able to complete. And some of us began to research him, specifically who are his full brothers. We found a find a grave listing for a deceased brother and thought maybe there'll be an obituary and we can identify other brothers. So we checked out the find a grave and were surprised to see that the gravesite details listed that on January 20th, 1980, Norm Grasser was reported missing from Chicago, Illinois. He was never heard from again, and there is no body interred, only a memorial tombstone. That tombstone was engraved with "Missing but not forgotten" and St. Anthony, pray for him. We also were touched to see a photograph of young Norm placed by Alan P. Grasser. We felt we had a strong lead for the identity of Rhinelander John Doe, and we wanted to update the Oneida County Sheriff's Department as soon as possible with this lead. So we scheduled a meeting for May 24th, where we shared the information with them and literally watched their astonishment with the news. This diagram illustrates the connections of a few of our top matches. Here we have Norm and our top match, Alan, his full sibling. On this side, we have our DNA matches that connect through the, oh, Alan, I'm so sorry. I should have gone over the pronunciations of these names with you. Schwering.
Schwering.
Schwering. And do you want to do the other one?
Sturenberg.
See, it's much more beautiful when you say it. And on the Norman's paternal side and Alan's dad as well, we have a match over here. Grasser and what is that one, Alan?
Rodis.
Rodis. Thank you. This map illustrates Norm's ancestry and is a great visual representation of the recent immigration that impacted this case. And we were on a good track to solving it. We got, this great match with Alan. I think we probably could have solved it. We had some of the names that we needed already in the tree. And of course, having Alan there and having this full sibling match was phenomenal. But 7 of Norm and Alan's great-grandparents were born in Germany or areas surrounding Germany. The remaining great-grandparent was born in Pennsylvania, but her parents were both born in Germany as well. So now I'm going to turn it over to Alan to tell you more about Norm and Alan's own journey.
Thank you, Tracy. My name is Alan Grasser, the brother of Norman John Grasser, formerly known as John Doe 1980, from Oneida County, Wisconsin. In my presentation today, I will try to give you a true and accurate representation of the events of Norm's early life before his disappearance on January 20th, 1980. Also, a timeline will be included of the 10-month-long journey from when I was first told that my poor brother was found until he was finally reinterred with our long-departed mother. In addition, all the circumstances of when, where, and how my brother died will be explained. I will also talk about some of the amazing events and coincidences that happened over the course of 40-plus years that made it possible for my brother to be found. And finally, in my conclusion, I will give a final thought relating to my brother's fate and difficult journey in life, plus the epiphany that I experienced at his funeral. Norman's biography. So Norm was born on Saturday, March 20th, 1948, in Chicago, Illinois, to his parents, Cyril Grasser and Marjorie Ney Schwering. He was my older brother, who I looked up to while growing up in Chicago. We both came from a typical middle-class, staunch Catholic family with Midwestern values and beliefs. We both went to parochial grade school and high school. Norm went 1 year to Loyola University, Chicago, at its Lakeshore campus, but dropped out the following year. Norm lived for a while on his own during the early 1970s. He worked as a mail carrier for the United States Postal Service then. It was during this time that he wrote a fictional novel about being young and a free spirit, but unfortunately, he couldn't get it published. He then turned his attention to writing our family's history and genealogy. During our youth, our mother's mom, our maternal grandmother, came to visit us from Iowa. It was during this trip to Chicago that she suffered a massive heart attack and became bedridden at her home for the next 10 years until her death at the advanced age of 91 in the year 1971. My brother spent many hours with her. He would listen to all of her stories and wrote down her life and times in an organized family tree. He began corresponding with all the older family members, recording their birth dates and the death dates of family that had already passed. He gathered and copied old family photos and also identified them all. He finally placed all of his research into a big scrapbook with handwritten stories for each family. My brother laid the foundation for the Grasser family history. The first entry of this genealogy, of course, was Norm's. But who would have thought that last year, because of him being found, his updated death date and location would be the last entry entered into our genealogy. The first and last entry, spanning over 50 years, was his own entry, which makes it the Alpha and the Omega, the first and last entry of our family history. Norm also loved going on long walks and exploring nature trails at the local forest preserves. This was the zeitgeist era of the 1960s and 70s, the spirit of the times with regards to the environmental protection movement. On many family trips to our family farm in northern Wisconsin, he would explore the wooded area of the farm that bordered the Peshtigo River. This was his real modus vivendi, his true way of life. He loved the great north woods of Wisconsin. And then sadly, on January 20th of 1980, shortly after Christmas, he disappeared at the age of 31 without a trace. This next segment covers the 10-month-long journey from when I was first notified of my brother being found until he was later reinterred with our mother. Well, it all started with the phone call, which came just out of the blue on the day after Memorial Day, May 30th, 2023. It was a Tuesday morning when Detective Sergeant Brian Barber of the United County Sheriff's Department called. I was at my family farm at the time and I missed his call, but he left a message that sounded very official. He said, "This is Detective Sergeant Brian Barber of the United County Sheriff's Department. Please return my call." I, I said to myself, holy scheisse, pardon my German expletive. I thought, what the hell did I do to warrant a call from the county sheriff? But when I called him back, he eventually asked me if I knew Norman Grasser. My mouth opened in disbelief. It must have been 10 seconds or more of silence before I slowly said, yes. He began saying that they believed they had identified my brother, who had been missing for 43 years. Just then, I felt my whole world becoming unbelievably so surreal. He and the Oneida County medical examiner, Crystal Schaub, wanted to see me in order to explain the case and perform a DNA test on me to be submitted to the FBI in Quantico, Virginia, for verification of a brother match to their John Doe 1980. They were prepared to travel to Chicago, but I told them that I was not in Illinois right now. I said that I was on my farm in Marinette County, Wisconsin, which was only a 2-hour drive from Oneida County. They both decided to come to my farm the next day. They stayed for over 3 hours explaining the case to me and finally left with my DNA sample. The medical examiner thought it would take maybe 2 or 3 months to receive the results. But after 3 months, I called Crystal Schaub, who in turn called the FBI and was told that it would be a minimum of 6 months. Unfortunately, during that time period, the horrific fire disaster on the Hawaiian island of Maui occurred. The city of Lahaina requested the FBI to help with identifying their burn victims using DNA analysis. Because the FBI prioritized the DNA identification for Maui victims, my DNA analysis was pushed back. Finally, after 7 months, I received a phone call from the ME, the medical examiner, on December 11th, 2023, that the DNA test that I took was a positive brother match with Oneida County's John Doe 1980. The ME then issued a press release on Friday, December 15th, 2023, that publicly announced that the case of John Doe 1980 was solved and that his name was Norman Grasser of Chicago. Because of Norm's Chicago connection, CBS News in Chicago that evening at 6 p.m. televised Chicago man's body identified by students after 43 years. In Marinette County, Wisconsin, where the Grasser family farm is located, the Peshtigo Times newspaper printed its headline on March 6, 2024, that read, "DNA finds 43-year-old missing person identity." And finally, Ramapo College in New Jersey ran its own story online at ramapo.edu that declared Ramapo College IGG students investigative genetic genealogy to identify John Doe in 43-year cold case. Back in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, on February 23rd of last year, the courts there approved the request that legally gave my brother's real name back to him by reissuing a revised death certificate and authorizing the exhumation of his remains, which happened later that day. His remains were cremated at a local funeral home and made available to me on March 1st, 2024, when I traveled to Rhinelander to bring him back home to Chicago. On Norm's birthday, March 20th, he was finally reinterred with our mother at All Saints Catholic Cemetery in Des Plaines, Illinois, thus ending the 10-month-long journey to be reunited with our family once again. This finally provided closure and an ending to the decades-long ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief following his disappearance. Traci, could you explain a little bit about the concept of ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief and how this all relates to closure?
Sure. This is something that Alan and I first talked about when we first talked about doing this presentation, and we wanted to make people aware of these things that affect people that have family members that are missing. Ambiguous loss was a term that was first coined by Dr. Pauline Boss in the 1970s. Originally, this term applied to families mourning a loved one whose loss was in some way unresolved, like a soldier missing in war or a kidnapped child. In the years since, this concept has expanded to include more common examples that many of us experience, such as divorce, adoption, estrangement, as well as when a person could be physically present but psychologically absent, such as dementia or mental illness. An ambiguous loss is characterized by the unending not knowing when someone is missing. It often goes hand in hand with disenfranchised grief. And this is a term that was first coined by Dr. Kenneth Doka in 1989. It refers to a grief that is from a loss that's not openly acknowledged or socially accepted. And these types of losses don't have the customary societal markers that we're used to, such as funerals or memorials. And therefore, there's no way to acknowledge the distress and loss that the family has, and they're left to mourn alone. Now, just a small thought about closure. Alan has told me that this presentation is part of his journey of closure, and it's an honor to be part of that. But closure is an internal journey for families that have lost loved ones. And when we return an identity to a decedent, now that's an answer. But it's up to the family to decide if that's closure or not. And some families may never get closure. It will just bring more questions. Okay, Alan.
Thank you, Tracy. The death of my brother. When did my brother die? Where did he die? And how? How did he die? These have been the foremost burning questions that have haunted me for over the last 43 years. The question of when he died will never be totally known because his body was discovered laying face up in a forested area that was not frequented by many people. March 19th, 1980 was the date that he was found, which was the day before his 32nd birthday. The autopsy report later revealed that his body was starting to decay, so his official death date could not be accurately determined. But the mere fact that he disappeared on January 20th showed that he was gone for only 9 weeks and 2 days before finding him dead. The question of where he was found, as revealed to me, was from his death certificate. The exact spot was about 4 miles north of Rhinelander, Wisconsin, just off of US Highway 17, in a secluded stand of pine trees. This area was officially located in the town of Pine Lake, Wisconsin. The sheriff's department believed that he was traversing by foot, possibly toward the city of Rhinelander, which is the county seat for Oneida County. And the last question of how he died was theorized by the medical examiner, referencing the autopsy finding that he suffered from a small contusion on the back of his head. This indicated that he might have fallen backwards after slipping and losing his balance on ice and or snow, thereby hitting the back of his head, rendering him unconscious. And because of the winter conditions at that time, his body began to shut down from the extreme cold exposure. He basically froze to death. The medical term is called hypothermia. The sheriff's department determined that the cause of death was accidental and that there was no foul play involved. Possible proof of that was the fact that his wallet contained a little over $25, which ruled out theft as a possible motive. Plus the fact that there was only one set of footprint tracks in the snow, indicating that he was alone. Unfortunately, the county sheriff's department could not find any proof of identity on him, and thus he was called John Doe, 1980, for the next 43 years. Piecing the puzzle together, Finding my brother could be similar to the analogy of the Brothers Grimm fairy tale, Hansel and Gretel, where in this case, the breadcrumb trail was actually a trail of clues that led back to me. Of course, DNA analysis played the biggest part of the puzzle. On August 29th, 2015, I took the Ancestry.com DNA test. I was the first in my family to do this. Because I did genealogy as a hobby, my motivation to take this test was strictly to find what my ethnicity was, not knowing that my DNA would one day lead to the identification of my long-lost brother. On a whim from a fellow genealogist relative of mine, I downloaded my raw DNA sequences from Ancestry.com and submitted it to FamilyTreeDNAs.com by doing a free autosomal DNA transfer. At the time, I really wasn't enthused with the amount of DNA matches from FamilyTreeDNA.com as compared with Ancestry.com's DNA matches. So going forward, I never really used FamilyTreeDNA.com's website, and after that, I sort of forgot about it. But according to Ramapo's IgG department, Ancestry.com's DNA database is secured and private, whereas FamilyTreeDNA.com was available for them to search. This streamlined their match back to me, that I was their guy. I found that to be an incredible and a coincidence that all happened. A number of years after my brother's disappearance, my parents decided to give me all of the family research that my brother had gathered. Life was pretty hectic back then for me, and I didn't have a chance to really go through all of his work. But gradually, I began recording all of his research onto a computer family tree program to expedite retrieval of family data. I also scanned all the old photo images and edited out all the defects with Microsoft's MS Paint program, which is a simple raster graphics editor. Over the years of doing genealogy, I periodically hit the proverbial brick wall many times. But one by one, I overcame those obstacles. Sometimes ideas came to me by chance interactions with other researchers. Sometimes solutions were revealed to me in dreams. But most of the time, it came from the ever-evolving source records that were made more and more available to the general public. My mantra for success with genealogy is that one can see further on the shoulders of others. One can see further on the shoulders of others. And today, I have accumulated over 30,000 person entries in my family tree. So I have definitely carried on my brother's legacy, which he had inadvertently instilled in me some 45 years ago. In 1995, a new forum appeared online that I fully embraced. It was created by Jim Tipton, a Salt Lake City resident, who named it Find a Grave. Over the years, I created numerous memorials on Find a Grave for my family that contained short biographies with photos. When my firstborn son died in 2014, and then my wife 2.5 months later died, basically from a broken heart, I memorialized both of them on Find a Grave. And it was in August of that year that I also memorialized my brother Norm, who had disappeared some 34 years earlier. I posted some of his favorite pictures. I also mentioned that he disappeared on January 20th, 1980, and that a missing person report was filed with the Chicago Police Department. Later in June of 2016, I commissioned a tombstone in memoriam to be made with his name on it and to be placed on her mother's grave. On this stone was the image of Saint Anthony. And for those of you that don't know, Saint Anthony is the patron saint for missing persons. I invoked Saint Anthony to pray for us that my brother was missing, but not forgotten. In 2023, my co-presenter, Ms. Traci Onders from Ramapo's IGG department, was the person that found this memorial that I had created 9 years prior. In retrospect, I was just trying to find closure and using Find a Grave as a means to an end. But each time that I did this, I was actually leaving breadcrumb clues back to me. And this discovery by Ms. Onders was the clue that sealed the deal with their investigation. Some final thoughts. While driving through the great north woods of Wisconsin on my way to Rhinelander to retrieve my brother's cremains, a song came on the radio. It was an older song from 1995, sung by a Canadian-American singer-songwriter who I believe won a Grammy Award for it, and her name was Alanis Morissette, and the song was called Ironic. And it starts out like this. An old man turned 98, he won the lottery and died the next day. It's a black fly in your Chardonnay. It's a death row pardon, 2 minutes too late. But in my head, I heard the last verse sounding like this. It's a missing brother who had lost his way, but DNA found him only 43 years too late. And isn't it ironic, don't you think? A little too ironic. And yeah, I really do think. And who would have thought it figures? One final thought. While attending my brother's funeral, I experienced an epiphany, a sudden revelation that there was something more than just a scientific explanation for finding my brother. I asked myself, why did I do the things and make the choices in my life that also made finding my poor brother possible? Why did I even take a DNA test on my own in the first place? Why did I upload my raw DNA to Family Tree DNA's searchable database? Why did I create my brother's public memorial on Find a Grave? Why did the medical examiner from Oneida County, Wisconsin, recover my brother's DNA after being in the grave for over 40 years? And why did Ramapo College of New Jersey IGG department select my brother's case for identification using reverse genetic genealogy? It occurred to me after looking at my brother's decade-old memorial stone again and seeing the image of St. Anthony on it and remembering the invocation that I had asked him to pray for us. But in doing so, I also implored him to help us in finding my brother. Because of all that, I truly believe that the choices in my life and others were also guided. Yes, guided by a divine power, which also contributed in finding my brother. At his funeral on March 20th of last year, which was also his birthday, I proclaimed in front of everyone that attended the service that I had been praying for this day to happen for 44 years. And through the intervention of St. Anthony, my prayers were finally and dramatically answered. My brother's cremains were finally reunited, our family, and buried with our mother, who suffered the most with his disappearance. And then looking upward, I thank St. Anthony for giving me his miracle in my life. In conclusion, I would like to take this opportunity to thank personally the Ramapo College of New Jersey Investigative Genetic Genealogy Department and all of its IGG alumni roadrunners. My deepest appreciation and humble thanks. I also want to send a special thank you to my co-presenter, Ms. Traci Onders, for her support in finding my breadcrumb clue on Find a Grave that led back to me. Thank you, Traci, so much. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
And thank you, Alan, for sharing your story and for being the beautiful, wonderful soul that you are. And I'm so glad that I've gotten the chance to get to know you. And Alan and I would like to leave you with some thoughts Hopefully we've convinced you on what a great tool investigative genetic genealogy can be to resolve some of these cold cases. But what can you do? Well, families and advocates for missing people, we recommend that you make yourself findable by DNA testing. So we're seeing many instances of people taking a consumer DNA test, such as Ancestry or 23andMe, to find out more about their ancestors. Maybe they never knew their grandparents or wondered about their family of origin. What they might find is their father left a life behind and moved across the country, created a new life, or possibly a parent was abducted as a child and didn't know, or an infant was switched at birth. As these databases grow, these stories are becoming more frequent. And what we want to tell families of missing individuals is make themselves findable. So take those tests. If you can do anything to raise awareness of the missing person, first make sure that you report them missing. You might be offered chances to provide DNA and dental records if you do that. Also, anything else like an online presence, such as a Facebook group or a memory video with photographs and details. Alan created this Find a Grave, which was the breadcrumb clue. If you're law enforcement, you might consider alternative sources of funding. Nonprofits like Ramapo can help with the expenses related, including lab expenses. And everyone can download their DNA results from Ancestry, 23andMe, or MyHeritage and upload them to GEDmatch, FTDNA, and DNA Justice. And Karen will provide some links for that as well. Okay, we're done.
All right, well, that was phenomenal. And thank you both for giving me a minute to get my voice together, because that presentation was just phenomenal. I didn't get to see it in person at RIG because I was in a different room. And so this was my first time being here live, and just wow, both of you, thank you so much for presenting. I've got a lot more to say, but we just don't have time. So I will get to the questions that people put into the Q&A section. The first question from Bonnie is, what is the average time to get a CODIS result? And I think that because of the timing of this question, it's about actually, rather than a CODIS result, a direct comparison result. So for example, when they took Alan's DNA to compare to Norm's DNA, we know that that took a long time. And so I think Bonnie's asking about the average. So I'll share what I've kind of seen, and then Traci, if you want to weigh in as well. I would say there is no average because it just depends entirely on what service is providing the direct comparison. So for example, in cases that I work in a state that doesn't have funding or doesn't have their own DNA lab, they're using federal resources to get the direct comparison, and that can take between a year to 18 months, even longer sometimes. I recall during COVID waiting something like 2.5 years for a comparison to be made. So whereas in New Jersey, where I work now, New Jersey State Police has their own lab, and their direct comparisons are usually done within a few weeks. So it just depends entirely on the resources available to the agency, but a few weeks to a few months on average, and then sometimes a year or more. Traci, would you concur with that?
I would absolutely concur. Yeah, it's very varied.
Yeah, and I guess as we saw in the case of Alan and Norm, disaster that affects the federal testing resources can impact that as well. Bonnie would also like to know, so this question is for Alan, was Alan advised of any of the stories that were published before they were published? So did you find out about these things like when they came out in the news, or did you know about any of them beforehand?
Well, the newspaper account in Chicago was, they just picked up the story from Rhinelander, and they played that automatically because there was a Chicago connection. I did get a copy of the Rhinelander newspaper article about it, which was basically all the information was given to them by the medical examiner, Crystal Schaub. At that time, I told Crystal that I didn't want to be, our family didn't want to be exposed to the media attention right in the beginning. And I initiated the newspaper account for the Peshtigo Times that's located near my farm to get a more in-depth story created. So I was actively involved with that story. And then later on, I found out that RIG 2024 was happening, and you people graciously invited me to come there to tell my story, and which I did, and gave me the opportunity to thank everyone there for finding my brother, which I really deeply appreciated.
Thank you so much, Alan. I mean, it was our pleasure to have you there, and
It was.
it's phenomenal. So thank you. There's no more questions, but there are a lot of nice comments for both of you in the chat. So I hope you'll get a chance to catch up with those. I'm going to leave our attendees with one final little tour of our website to take a look at some of the things that Traci was just mentioning about things that you can do to help with cases like these. This is our Ramapo College Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center webpage. It's located at ramapo.edu/IGG. There's a lot of information here about what we do, but the thing I want to call your attention to is this link on the left-hand side, how you can help. And this has some information about how you can support the IGG Center through donations, how you can donate, how you can volunteer with our team. I will say that almost all of our volunteers are former students of the IGG Center. So we don't take volunteers very often, but when we do, we usually pull from our graduates. And then the part that I really want to point you to is how to contribute your DNA profile. So I have videos here with a step-by-step process of how to upload your DNA profile to DNA Justice and how to upload to GEDmatch. I don't have a video about how to upload to Family Tree DNA because it's a little bit more complicated right now with those uploads. So I haven't made a video of that just yet, but those are the 3 databases that we can use to search our genetic profiles for IGG cases. At the end of this page, I also have some resources to teach your community about IGG. So if you want to give a presentation at your library or with your local genealogy group, there is a slide presentation with a script so that you can speak about IGG in your community. So all of these resources are here for you at ramapo.edu/IGG, and click on how you can help. One of my favorite things that I just saw when I was looking at the attendee list, there are actually people in here that we have done outreach to because we thought that they might be related to one of our John or Jane Does. So thank you for being here. We really appreciate you, and please keep up to date with us on social media for our next webinar presentation. And with that, I will thank Traci and Alan once again for being here. Thank you both so much, and I hope everybody has a great rest of your night. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
See you all later.
Bye.